called the Liberty Amendments.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. Well, I wrote Liberty and Tyranny. I wrote Meritopia and some other books, and trying to diagnose from a philosophical point of view some of the huge problems of the left and some of the strengths of conservatism. And by the way, in Liberty and Tyranny and Meritopia, I talk about the importance of faith to the framers and the founders. And I also explain in those books how the left has faith, too. They have faith in government, obviously, and government is their God to a great extent, and they're constantly praying at false idols, these programs that they create. But in the Liberty Amendments, I decided, what can we do about this from a constitutional perspective or a philosophical or political perspective? And, of course, part of the problem is our cultural problem. But I'm not good enough to address that. I leave that to you guys and some others, but there's a definite overlap. You can't really ignore one and expect the other to work out. But my focus is on what the framers gave us in terms of the Constitution. And in the Constitution, they told us under Article 5, if Congress becomes oppressive or the federal government becomes oppressive, that there needs to be something short of a violent response. And the response is for the state legislatures to get together and to help fix it. If they're still willing and still can muster the courage to do it, and under Article 5, if two-thirds of the state legislatures send delegates to a meeting, a state convention, they can propose amendments to the rest of the states. Three-fourths of the states would have to ratify, just as they did when Congress proposed amendments. And if we believe in federalism, as I do, and by the way, it's not perfect. There's a lot of really lousy states out there. But if we believe in federalism, we believe the state legislatures and the people through the state legislatures need to have primacy, then this is what the framers told us to do. And I believe we live in a post-constitutional period. I believe we have for decades. I personally am sick and tired of the Supreme Court every June telling us how we're going to live without any recourse whatsoever. I'm tired of Congress passing massive bills that they don't read, which the Constitution does not allow. And then they tell us to figure out how our lives are going to be affected after they install it. And the President of the United States saying if, the other branches of the government don't agree with him, well, then he'll act on his own. And then finally, this massive bureaucracy spitting out 3,000 laws a year. This is not a constitutional republic anymore. I don't know what it is, but it's not a constitutional republic.
We're talking with Mark Levin. He's the author of The Liberty Amendments, Restoring the American Republic. Mark, tell us about Chapter 4. It's called An Amendment to Establish Term Limits for Supreme Court Justices and Supermajority Legislative Override. What are you thinking about there?
Well, I'll give you an example. People hold the Supreme Court up as if it's more perfect than the other institutions in our government, and if these individuals in the court, I even say, if they're even of flesh and blood, they treat them like they're some kind of deity, and they're not. The Supreme Court has upheld slavery. The Supreme Court has upheld segregation. The Supreme Court has upheld the internment of Japanese Americans. The Supreme Court has upheld, in Roe v. Wade, abortion at all levels. And it's had some good decisions, too, but the point is it's not a perfect body, and these people aren't perfect. And so what do we do about this? Well, first of all, the framers never intended the Supreme Court to have this kind of power and to be running these endless constitutional conventions every time they sit and rewriting the Constitution. That's number one. Number two, if they're going to have lifetime appointments, then they're supposed to be applying and interpreting the Constitution, not advancing their own personal policy objectives. So this chapter is intended to address that, as I think the framers would have addressed it if they saw what's going on today. And it term limits Supreme Court justices to 12 years each, which is a long time. And it also empowers Congress by 3/5 votes of its members, or the state legislatures by 3/5 votes of the state legislatures, to override a Supreme Court majority decision within 24 months of the issuance of that decision, not amend it or just expunge it. Because there has to be recourse. We cannot have 5 Americans sitting there dictating to us telling California what it's going to do, telling every town how it's going to behave, rewriting Obamacare, and then there's no recourse whatsoever. That's not a republic. That's a Politburo. So my view is the broadest possible input from society through representation, not majoritarianism, not populism, not anything of that sort, which would be disastrous, but through representatives. The state legislatures needs to address that. In other words, final decision-making wouldn't be left with one justice. It'd be left with 3/5 of the states and 3/5 of the members of Congress.
We're talking to Mark Levin. One more question for you, Mark. So just to be clear, you're asking for a constitutional convention?
No. What the Constitution calls this is a convention of the states for proposing amendments. There can be no constitutional convention. There's nothing in the Constitution that authorizes a constitutional convention. The state legislatures would pick the delegates. The state legislatures could pull the delegates back if they get out of control. The state legislatures would decide in advance the topics they want to discuss, because they're not going to just agree to have this meeting willy-nilly. And ultimately, 3/4 of the states would have to ratify, just as they've done 27 times, whatever comes out of this, just as they would have to ratify whatever comes out of Congress. But I start from the premise that Congress, the courts, the president, and the bureaucracy are already unhinged from the Constitution. They're already changing it, and that we need to address it.
Yeah. Well, I can't argue with you, and I don't see anybody can, because it's the things that are done today and come out of Washington. Like you said, the Supreme Court is like, they dictate our lives, 5-4, and it's amazing. Anyway, Mark, thanks for your time. We wish you the best. The book is called The Liberty Amendments: Restoring the American Restoring the American Republic, I should say, published by Threshold Editions and available in bookstores everywhere. And Mark's website is Mark Levin, Levin, show, SHOW.com. Mark has a national radio show of his own.
And God bless you.
Thank you, Mark.
I greatly appreciate it. Take care.
All right. I hear his I hear his show from time to time. He is a very brilliant man, obviously, as you can tell.
He's on often with Sean Hannity in the evenings, and Sean's a big admirer. And the thing that strikes me, whether I watch him on TV or I just listening to him now, is how clear, how articulate he is. Here's a man who isn't just making noise, but he has really thought through.
Yeah.
And, we didn't have time to get into it, but there are, I think 10 different amendments that he thinks would restore the American Republic. And he gives the constitutional background, the difference they would make. This is a very, very good book called The Liberty Amendments, Restoring the American Republic by Mark Levin.
You would say, well, that's impossible. That could never happen. We'll never go back for another amendment to the Constitution. But like you said, it's happened how many amendments?
27 times.
27 times, so it isn't like it's unprecedented. It hasn't happened in recent history. But what Mark is saying is, look, the system is completely broke, and his word is we've become unhinged from the Constitution, which is what we're supposed to live by in this country and govern by in this country, and we got to get back to it, and the only way we get back to it is by the states coming together and adopting, a new way of moving forward that are more representative of the original writings of our founding fathers.
The interesting thing about the way you just put that, because you asked him about the Constitutional Convention,
right?
And he said what we're talking about here is a convention of the states to propose amendments. That's in the text of the U.S. Constitution. It just hasn't happened since the beginning. I mean, we're so used to amendments starting in Congress, we've almost lost the idea that states as states can come together to propose amendments to the Constitution. But it's perfectly, everything he's talking about, the method is perfectly constitutional. I mean, Tim, if we're waiting for the Senate and the House to agree on these kinds of amendments, we're going to have to wait